I'm excited because in this episode, number one, we're going to talk about a movie that both Nathan and I have seen, momentous. 2, we both like it. And 3, this is for me, it's not a horror film. You'll like this. Come on, listen in.
Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I have no meteorological confidence in rodents. I'm just going to throw that out there from the start. But today we want to talk about Groundhog Day, which you will be hearing a day after Groundhog Day because this podcast will come out the day after Groundhog Day. But anyway, Cameron, this actually catches your imagination for some reason, and I'm still trying to grapple with why it's such a thing. Tell me what you're thinking.
Well, first of all, any excuse I can get to talk about movies with you is...
Well, see, you're going to movie immediately.
Jump at the opportunity.
Yeah, but okay. So, all right. Yeah, we'll go that way.
Yeah. So, well, so Groundhog Day as a tradition is a really strange tradition. And I think we can talk about that first, maybe, because you had mentioned, as we were talking about it, that if ever there was an indication that we are not a postmodern or late modern society, it is that we still celebrate Groundhog Day and the meteorological predictions of a rodent. So it points up the persistence of kind of mythological thinking in human beings, which...
And I want to be clear. I know people who've gone to Puxatawny to watch this thing happen. And just a little historical background here. 1877, there was a groundhog hunting club that started this. So February 2nd, 1877 was when the Puxatawny thing gets started. And so other towns now also have their own Groundhog Day and their own predictive rodents. But I think Puxatawny Phil is like the pope of rodent meteorology. I mean, that is the one that people know of. And so I think the whole thing is hilarious. I know people have gone to the celebration. I mean, tens of thousands of people tune in. It still makes the headlines. Like, you'll see it somewhere today.
Oh, yeah.
6 more weeks of winter based off of the groundhog. So I think the whole thing is hilarious. And I think most of the reason that we do it is because, or when I say we, it's a broad sense, because it is hilarious and goofy and it's an oddball thing. And nobody, I think, changes their schedule based off of it at all. But even though it just started in 1877, there was a long history. So this came with German immigrants who had a long history of using rodents for forecasting beforehand. So,
really?
Yeah. So
I should know that.
There's a history that goes before this. So anyway, I would say at that point, though, what I was jokingly saying about not being postmodern is the sense in which you're using a rodent to determine the future weather. You would say, oh, that's super superstitious or old school, not neo-paganism, like original, or wives' tale, whatever. And we can get into the Farmer's Almanac if we need to later on that one. But that the fact that we still celebrate something that clearly has roots in craziness just fascinates me to no end. The end.
Well, I think I'm going to give a long list of books here. So if you write these down, but if you are,
I would just like to point out the hilarity of, let's talk about Groundhog. Cameron, I'm going to give you a long list of books. It's just perfect.
Well, just these are writers who will puncture a hole, basically, in the notion that we are disenchanted people eking out an empty existence against the flat horizon of modernity. That is itself, ironically, a modern myth. So here's a real striking assertion. This comes from the theologian John Milbank. This is from his monumental book, Theology and Social Theory. So I would definitely recommend that book. It's lengthy, it's not accessible, and it's very demanding. So there you have it. If you're up for that challenge...
You really sold it.
Yes, but again, accessibility is overrated. It really is. I mean, life is rich and complex. And if you want thinkers who are actually going to give you real penetrating insight into why we think the way we do, why we live the way we do, you're going to have to Yeah, you're gonna have to deal with some complexity. Not everybody has to read this book, but I'm just saying if you're interested, this is a book that can really help you. But toward the beginning of that book, John Milbank says, and we'll spend some time with this because this is a controversial claim, but he says theology, modern theology or current theology tends to buy into s- the assumption that we're a secular society, whereas increasingly social theory finds the notion of secularity more and more paradoxical and sees that humanity is a mytho-religious creature, and that is part of how we think, that's part of how we live. And if you exclude that from the account, you're not giving a full account of human beings as they actually are.
Yeah, so
I think yeah,
a proper anthropology of humanity is that we are essentially religious creatures, and
absolutely.
I
We
use
are I mean,
essentially in the
essentially.
literal sense there.
Yes. And that doesn't change with the advent of modern science or the Industrial Revolution. It doesn't change in a post industrial society. So, some of the other books that hone in on this theme that are worth paying attention to. And again, none of these are quote easy, but they're all really helpful. Another one is the French social theorist who we just lost, Bruno Latour, Latour. Bruno Latour's most famous book is called We Were Never Modern.
S
Very helpful book. Will challenge a lot of your assumptions, but it's making this same claim about human beings. And then a more recent one would be The Myth of Disenchantment. And really, that's a perfect title. It kind of it's a very rich study and exposition of the fact that human beings, even the most seemingly secular thinkers, were not at all the disenchanted beings that you think they are, but very, very interested in myths. I mean, right now, Nathan, forget Groundhog Day. Just look at our cultural obsession with the occult right now.
Oh, yeah.
I
I
mean,
will believe we're postmodern when newspapers stop carrying horoscopes.
right. Horoscopes. Well, and now with the advent of apps, all of that,
Mhm. Yeah.
apps and podcasts. I mean, just look at the proliferation of stuff on. I mean, everything from new age meditation techniques to tarot cards are immensely popular right now. So it's not exactly a picture of a flattened horizon. So anyway, so that's why the persistence of something like Groundhog Day, I don't think it's
Okay,
not
hey, s
surprising if you're not accustomed to that way of looking at people.
yeah, okay, so let's loop back here, though, because I need you to flesh something out for all of us, and this is a very important point, because people will say, "Look, religion is on the decline. Only 30% of Americans claim to be, Christian or part of a church. It used to be
Mhm.
90% in the 50s. The rise of different
Yep.
religions, the rise of people who don't identify as any other this is
Nuns, yep.
the nuns, yeah. And we're talking
Not
about
monastery
nuns.
nuns.
Yeah, not the monastery nuns. The okay, so what gives in the sense that it does seem like
Yep.
formal and structural religion is waning.
It's a very fair question.
However, so that would be the pushback to the conversation we're having. People are like, no, people are less religious than ever. And so it's a bold claim for us to be coming out and being like, we call your bluff.
Yeah, absolutely. So institutional religion or formal religion certainly on the decline, but not spiritual explorations by a long shot. So it's basically the difference between the old adage of I'm spiritual but not religious still holds true. Many people want spirituality, but they just want it on their own terms. So there's a consumer approach to it, or cafeteria spirituality is another way of putting it.
Hmm.
But increasingly, Nathan, I'm going to push back even more. Increasingly, I think you're seeing more of a resistance to that though as well, and there is more of a push that's happening, and I think there's more of a push coming toward formal expressions of religion. Now, that's not necessarily Christianity, but for instance, I know more and more people who would describe themselves as Wiccan, for instance. Now, whatever we may think of Wicca, I mean, there are formalized rituals there. It is an actual community. There are kind of organizing principles. Look at the rate of conversions to Islam, for instance, which
Hmm.
is remains surprising to me given the public image of Islam, especially in recent years. I mean, Islam has, for very understandable reasons, had a huge PR problem, which is saying it like that runs the risk of trivializing some of what's happened. But you get what I mean. I think as our culture becomes more and more what's the word here? I mean, we've got a sense of real disintegration happening. People want to find stability and they want to find roots. This is why in Christian spaces, there's a pronounced interest now in high church traditions. And that's not surprising. Just if you have a moment of where you seem to be in dissolution, cultural dissolution, where there seems to be a great lack of stability, you look for something with firm, with roots. You look for something that has a real tradition and a real
Yeah.
structure that seems to offer stability, right?
Well, if you're drowning in the river of chaos, you're gonna lunge and grasp onto anything that has roots, even if that thing has thorns in
And
it.
structure, right? Yeah.
So I'm just
Yep.
saying, we look at some of these things and say, why would somebody embrace that? And the question is because the alternative is literal chaos.
Correct.
So we
Yes.
would
And so
rather
I
hold
mean,
on to things that wound us and not die than the
yes.
alternative.
Well, I mean, that's the siren song of fundamentalism, is what I've called that. And I'm using fundamentalism in a much more broad sense, where you're deeply drawn to something that has very firm structure. It's very clear, has a pronounced lack of ambiguity. So I think you're going to see more and more of that. That is happening more and more. I mean, look at Europe, where you're seeing a resurgence of certainly far right tendencies, and in some cases worse tendencies. But also here in the United States, you have, we were listening to a recent fascinating podcast, which I think we would like to discuss that in more depth at a future date, possibly with a guest. But it was between you recommended it, Nathan. It's Russell Moore interviewing Ross Douthat.
Mhm.
But Russell Moore asked him really good questions, and one of them was about the Catholic integralist movement, which
Uh-huh, yeah.
is a sort of sees it's a kind of Constantinian, imperial vision of the Catholic Church at the helm again. But I mentioned that's a potentially distracting example, but it's not an isolated incident. You're seeing more and more of that kind of thinking, and on the part
Well
of some pretty sophisticated thinkers as well.
I mean, and it's not globally unique. I mean, that's the whole deal with Sharia
Right.
law, is that this orders and
Exactly. Yep.
stabilizes society. So you just need a very
Mhm.
heavy-handed, theologically authoritarian framework, and people willfully join that.
Right. Yep. And so I think what Nathan and I are trying to do here is not be apologists for that in any sense, but trying to show you the appeal in a moment like this when you have what feels like very chaotic times. There's a real draw to that kind of stability, even if it comes through coercion or enforcement. So, I mean, it's definitely, I think, driven by desperation in some sense, but the whole sort of really nebulous version of spirituality is still very, very strong, I think, in the United States, because we do tend to be very individualistic and we do want our spiritual commitments on our own terms. And I think that's going to be with us for a while, but I
Mhm.
think there's a powerful pull in a little bit more of a thick direction as well.
So
But yeah, certainly you're seeing some decline, but it's way more complex than that. It's not just it. So I mean, Nathan, how would you respond to somebody who says, "Well, yeah, there's a decline, a precipitous decline in church attendance here in the United States, therefore we're getting more secular." Because I think that's
y
something that people would say. How would you? I mean, obviously, another guy we
well,
like is
we're getting
Charles Taylor.
yeah,
He's
so
going
we're
to have a
getting more
really interesting response to that.
yeah, so we're getting more secular if the opposite of secular is institutional churches. But if
Right.
institutional church is not the definition of the opposite of secular, then I think not. So some of it
Right.
is that Christianity has had such an oversized influence that it has become the metric by which we can measure change in religious practice. So I think it's just so that's fair, but we want to recognize that that's fairly unique for our time. So 21st century
Yeah, and
North
I'm
America.
gonna make a bold statement here that I don't actually think is that bold if you're a Christian.
I'm gonna make a
Look, if
bold,
human
not bold statement.
if right, bold, it'll sound bold to our in our cultural context, but it's not bold. But a lot of Christians have bought into this, I think. If Christianity is true and human beings are made in the image of God, by God, for God, we have eternity in our hearts, we're inescapably spiritual creatures, then it follows that it's impossible to have a thoroughly disenchanted world. It won't happen.
And there never has been.
We may not have. No, it never has been. It just never has been. And I say this as somebody who at one point in my intellectual life did think that, actually. I did think, well, it's the world now is a kind of flattened horizon, and there's this sense of emptiness and hollowness all the time. Now, there is a sense of, I think, loneliness and emptiness and isolation, but you
Well,
can't completely evacuate that sense of the something more, or that mythic religious dimension of human life. It never goes away,
so
ever.
okay, let me bring in here. I think I've used this before. Probably, man, probably is my favorite Peter Kraft. Um, I can't remember what lecture it's in, but so he was talking about, because when we talk about postmodernism and like people talk about like buildings that have stairs that don't go anywhere, and you hear all that, like those are very, very
Mhm.
isolated examples of things that are there artistically in the world, but by and large, people aren't living that way. So Peter Kraft points out that you can have totally ridiculous ideas that are totally disconnected from reality, that produce and do nothing and have a totally successful academic career. He said, and but the flip side is you cannot have totally crazy ideas that are totally disconnected from reality, that totally don't produce anything or make any sense, and be a successful farmer. And he
Mhm.
said at one point we lived in a time in which we had 10 farmers for every PhD, and now we live in a time in which we have 10 PhDs for every farmer. And that's the feel of the transition into post-modernity. Um, and I just think it's hilarious because he's basically parsing out like the structures that exist in chaos that have to be supported by other structures. So like you have to have the farmer who knows how the world works in order to grow the potato to feed the philosopher who's talking nonsense, but you don't
Mhm.
have to have it the other way around. And
Right.
it's the unilateral support system there that is why, to some degree, will never be truly postmodern. So is Nietzsche not the best example of somebody who kind of thought through the logical conclusions of what a theistic less world would look like? Um, and that was a long time ago, and we still haven't gotten there. So this is not a matter of, I don't think, don't hear Nathan and Cameron saying, "Oh, everything is fine." Certainly not. Like religious Christian people like ourselves have a lot of work to do to figure out how we fit into this, but probably properly diagnosing the posture of humanity around us is a necessary prerequisite to doing anything helpful.
Yeah, and if we bear in mind that human beings are inescapably spiritual creatures, that's going to change the way, or help enhance our conversations when we talk to people, to understand that, people are looking for grand stories,
Mhm.
despite what you may hear about, a lack of meaning, or people completely being averse to any kind of, larger story. People, I mean, we seek that out. We if you look, and now you thought you could get out of it, Nathan. If you look in the realm of pop culture and movies and
Oh,
all
here we
that,
go.
these, I
Here
mean,
we go.
again, here, these, you can think of these as, I mean, first of all, they're many of them are works of art. They're made for entertainment too, but they're also for making tools for making sense. They're sense making tools of life. This is part of how
Mhm.
we make sense of life. Now, interestingly enough, Groundhog Day, the movie, which is what's momentous about this, is that Nathan, this is a movie that Nathan and I both like,
We've both seen.
and we've both seen it. I mean, okay, yes, the first
It's
first
it's even
amazing
stranger.
feature is
Yeah.
that, yeah, it's strange thing number 1, we've both seen it. Number 2, we both like it, and 3, for me, it's not a horror movie. So
Well,
there
yeah,
you go.
except for the fact that you probably like it philosophically, and I just think it's funny.
Oh no, I just think it's a funny film.
Okay,
So
all right.
here's I'm gonna well, yeah, I mean, here's
L-
yeah, you
Lay it
just
out
like
for
it.
us.
It's
Lay it
funny.
out for us. Lay it out for us.
Well, I mean, one thing that bugs me though about a lot of we Christians, we just love to just dissect everything and try to, get the worldview, get everything out of it. But I'm a big believer in that. No, just enjoy the movie first. If you don't enjoy it, you're not going to get anything. And also, you often hear Christians say things like, "Well, we need to learn to read movies." That is ridiculous. Don't read movies. Watch movies. It's a visual language. I mean, often Christian analysis will miss so much because they're not actually watching it. They're just dissecting it to try to put it into some pre-existing worldview category. Again, nothing wrong with that necessarily per se, but first, enjoy the dang movie. And in the case of Groundhog Day, I mean, this movie is just a delight. I mean, this is prime Bill Murray, though. I mean, he is when he. I mean, he's in his element. His
There you go,
absolutely
folks. A recommendation for Bruno
deadpan.
Latour and Bill Murray, all in one podcast.
Well, yeah, I mean, as deadpan as it gets, cynical, mean-spirited, but it's a film that does, and here's where we could get into some of I mean, yeah, I mean, in some ways it is a philosophical film, but
No, you don't
it's a
watch
film
Groundhog
about a
Day
man
for
who.
some sort of moral development or growth
But
formation.
see, that's the whole thing though. It actually does have real moral development. You have a
I
guy
mean, he
who is a
does. Yeah.
genuine. Well, yeah, I mean, you have a guy who's a Phil. So Phil is a genuinely bad person in this movie. He's, in the sense that he's conceited, he's selfish, and doesn't really. I mean, doesn't basically hates this assignment that he has to do, where he has to go to Puxatawny to cover, Puxatawny Phil and the whole Groundhog Day. He's a meteorologist. He thinks of himself as, you know. I think there's a line at one point, what's the weather tomorrow? It's whatever I say it is. He sees himself as this kind of godlike. And then he goes there. He's got contempt for everybody there, thinks it's a backwater place. But throughout the course of this movie, we could talk about the little plot device that most of you already know. But throughout the course of this movie, he there's genuine moral development. It's not done in a preachy, annoying, didactic way. And he actually ends up by becoming a person who is truly himself, but also, is it genuinely drawn to goodness, the good. That's something to celebrate in a fun comedy.
I would like to commend you on being able to pass up the opportunity to harp on the value of repetition for virtuous development.
Oh, I didn't do that, you're right, that and that's a
That
that's a
would have
little
fit right in
soapbox of
there.
mine.
That would have been right on. Yeah.
Yeah, and also I'm gonna put it in the show notes, but there's a fantastic essay that was written by a guy named Jeff Reimer, who's an editor at Comment Magazine. He wrote this for Comment Magazine, and it's on Groundhog Day. It's probably one of the better. Yeah, one of the better pieces I've read on
Give us
on
the quick
Groundhog Day.
summary.
There's a lot of stuff. Well, people have written PhDs on on Groundhog Day. But well, no, I mean, so Jeff Reimer's basic thesis is that in Groundhog Day, he says, first of all, he has some really good discussion of what the genre is. Because sometimes Groundhog Day gets classified as science fiction because
Hmm.
it does have it
Yeah,
has this
time warp.
interesting plot
Yeah.
device. Yeah, where he's in a time warp. He's in a loop. So yeah, he goes to this place, he hates it, blah, blah, blah. And then he wakes up every day, it's Groundhog Day. It's the same day every day. And so he goes through all these different phases. He goes through a totally hedonistic phase where he just, eats whatever he wants. He goes, he plans this really elaborate armed robbery over the course of knows how many different repetitions. Then he goes through the despairing phase where
So
he
Ecclesiastes,
kills
basically, Bill Murray style.
pretty much Ecclesiastes. Yeah, I mean, he kills himself. At one point, he says, "I've killed myself so many times. I don't even know. I don't even know if I still exist." But and again, this is. But there are some moving moments in this too. Then when he begins to finally have a change of heart. So first of all, Jeff Reimer points out it's not really a science fiction movie. Though people who tie themselves in knots, and there are people who tie themselves in knots. The internet exists, and there are you can go down a rabbit hole of endless YouTube speculation on how the loop works, how long Phil Connors is actually stuck in Puxatawny and blah blah. He says that all kind of misses the point. The real focus is on his character in this movie, and he said it also gets categorized as a romantic comedy because there's this relationship that develops between him and the woman Rita, portrayed by Annie McDowell, and she's really kind of a vision of I think purity, moral goodness, and purity. But it's not really so much about that. It's really about the development of his character. And what he points out really beautifully in the essay, and I'd encourage you once again to read it, is that toward the end of the film, he doesn't lose himself as he becomes a better person and as he becomes less selfish. And ironically, he becomes more himself. He's more Bill Murray esque or, Phil Connors esque, but he is enchanted now by goodness. And this change of heart enriches his life. It doesn't rob it of its joy and its luster, but it also comes with him accepting the fact of his own limitations, his mortality. So you end up getting some very old school kind of lessons in this movie. And he also points out that the glittering vices professor who you like, Nathan, she
Oh,
she
Rebecca
actually
DeYoung.
right, yeah, Rebecca DeYoung talks about the movie quite a bit actually in that book. And for good reason, because it's centered on the virtues without being preachy. And I think that's another reason to watch it because look, I mean, we are in a uniquely prudish moment in our culture. In many ways, things have gone from a Christian standpoint, things have gone are morally askew, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of moralistic art right now. I mean, just look
Mhm.
at the Disney's recent output. Everything's trying to tell you what you should be endorsing, what you should be all about, and what you should be celebrating. And it's doing so in a manner that's not very subtle. But this movie actually is a moral tale that's not a total buzzkill. So hey, that's something to be celebrated.
That you just did some good work there, Cameron, in redeeming February 2nd to look for character development in it, so I appreciate that.
Well, I
The
mean, it's a tough time. Come on,
Yeah, tough
we're in
times,
the
tough
dead of
times.
winter. Everybody needs
Yeah.
something good.
The so can I so I'm thinking about part of why the movie so I think the movie captivates people's imagination for the same reason that the actual day does. Alright, you ready for this?
Let's
Um,
hear it.
in the sense that the predictive element is the craved thing or the thing that makes it funny. So
Hmm.
the funny scenes of the movie are when he knows exactly what's going to happen because he's been
Oh
there
yeah.
and done that before. What are we doing when we pull a groundhog out of his hole and try to see what the weather's going to be for the next 6 weeks? We're wanting a predictive certainty about the future and we'll go at any lengths including using a rodent to try to figure that out. What are you doing when you read a
Hmm.
horoscope? What are you doing when you use tarot cards? What do you so all of this quasi spirituality is really about having certainty of the future or predictive possibilities in order to empower ourselves or to protect ourselves against the unknown or what comes next in the cycle or the loop.
Hmm.
And it seems
That's
to
a
me,
that's good. That's insightful.
oh, look at that. Okay.
I
I'm
like
gonna
that.
write another article. To me, so it seems inherently as goofy as it all is, it seems inherently self-seeking um, to use spirituality as a predictive and a protective element,
Hmm.
especially then when you throw that up against Christianity, like the parallels just aren't there.
Hmm.
So give us this day our daily bread, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, deliver us from evil. These types of things where we're not really putting ourselves in a posture of power
Or
or
control.
or control.
Yeah.
And so it seems to me that that is the spiritual loss that's happening. Like if we're
Mm.
secularizing, it's that we're trending toward forms of spirituality. The occult. What are you trying to do
Right.
with the
Control.
occult? Is
Yeah.
you're trying to control spirits and
Yep.
guide and even I mean talk to
Hmm.
anybody in missions and shamanism and everything else.
Yep.
Like it's about power and control and manipulating spirits to have the
Yep.
desired effect physically that you want in the world. And that just doesn't fit within Christianity. And so it's kind of like when we say that we're not really post Christian or postmodern or post secular, we're all still on the same court, just playing a different game here. And
Yeah. It's
Christianity
good.
stands out as a very different alternative to what I essentially see as a high degree of a desire to be our own gods manifest through atheism to the occult to tarot cards to I'm not going to throw Puxatani Phil in there. I'm just saying, but the
Yeah.
historical desire to know and to predict the future and the theoretical piece that that gives us, considering the fact that meteorologically Puxatani Phil has been accurate 46% of the time.
Right. And
But
also, I mean,
so anyway,
yeah.
just so some thoughts on predictive power and control of the future.
And those are good thoughts. And they hone it. I mean, there's a key aspect of the plot that revolves around that, Nathan. I don't know if you remember, but the whole reason Phil Connors gets stuck in Puxatawny is because his weather prediction fails. So
Oh.
he fails to predict the blizzard that ends up marooning them in this town. And part of his conceit is he's a meteorologist, so he knows the future. He has insight. He can control. And that is exactly what goes wrong, and then that's part of what precipitates this really long lesson. The other point that Jeff makes in the article, which is really good, is that we should look at Groundhog Day not as science fiction, but as a modern myth. And in the myths, we take for granted the interference on the part of the gods in the affairs of human beings. And the gods, of course, are capricious. Sometimes, they have some not so their motives aren't so noble, but other times they're trying to instruct morally. And in this particular story, the gods, so to speak, have taken an active interest in the character of Phil Connors, and so mess with him with hilarious results. One of our friends, Kryn, hey Kryn, one of our friends, his favorite line in the movie is, I don't know if you remember this, Nathan, but there's a kid who falls out of a tree, and Phil, during his virtuous phase, starts to save him and catch him. And one day on the, I don't know, who knows how many times he's caught him, he puts him down and he goes, "You have never thanked me." But yeah,
So
please
we
watch
are
this movie.
so okay. I was skeptical that we were going to be able to tie all of this together, but I think somewhere in there is a thread of coherence on the allure of the film and what the repetition and interest in the future and how time works and how we are to live in it plays out. Maybe it's a thin thread, but
No,
I
I
think
think
we
it
had
works.
something. Yeah.
I'm patting myself on the back, and I'm patting you on the back too for sticking with us through this conversation about a movie. We went all the way from sort of secular secularization theories all the way to Groundhog Day, a modern comedy classic, which I, for one, hope you watch, and I also hope you read the essay from Jeff Reimer that we will include in the show notes. But thanks for hanging with us. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and recent movies and Christian hope.
Quick, Cameron. What are some other names for a groundhog?
I don't know.
Woodchuck, whistle pig, field grizzly, all kinds of.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.